Richard Joshua Reynolds built the largest cigarette empire in America. He died of pancreatic cancer at 68, poisoned by his own product. His grandson was killed at 20 under circumstances that were never resolved. His great-grandson testified before Congress to tear the family business apart, and a cartoon camel his company created was as recognizable to 6-year-olds as Mickey Mouse. It all started in a town of 400 people with no paved roads, 200 miles from the ocean, that ended up becoming the 8th largest customs port in the United States, without a single ship, because one man needed so much Turkish tobacco and French rolling paper that the federal government had to open a customs office in the middle of nowhere. At its peak, the company born in that town employed 23,000 workers, manufactured 105 billion cigarettes in a single year, and controlled 43% of every cigarette sold in America, not of its brand, of all cigarettes in the country. And today, the most American cigarette brand that ever existed belongs to a British corporation. And the factories where trillions of camels were rolled now, house laboratories where scientists grow human organs and search for cures for cancer. This is the story of how you build a monster, and what's left when the monster dies. Richard Joshua Reynolds was born on July 20th, 1850, at the Rock Spring Plantation near Critz, in Patrick County, Virginia, a place so remote that the nearest mountain was called Nobisness Mountain, as if the geography itself was sending a warning. His father, Hardin William Reynolds, was a landowner, tobacco trader, and slaveholder. He owned roughly 8,000 acres of land and dozens of enslaved people. The young Reynolds grew up watching tobacco being grown, dried, and sold, not in books, in the fields, with other people's hands. He spent 2 years at Emory and Henry College, but dropped out to work with his father. In 1873, he enrolled at Bryan and Stratton Business College in Baltimore. And here's the detail that defines the man. He paid his tuition by selling his father's chewing tobacco to merchants around the city. He didn't have a company yet, didn't have a factory yet, and he was already selling. He went back to Virginia, formed a partnership with his father, and a year later sold his share. He was 24 years old, with one very clear idea. He didn't want to be anyone's partner. He wanted to be the boss. Why did he pick Winston, North Carolina? A town of 400 people, where there was practically nothing. Because it had two things Patrick County didn't. It sat right in the center of the new flu-cured tobacco market, and it had a railroad. The Northwestern North Carolina Railway connected to Greensboro. Reynolds understood something many of his competitors didn't. It doesn't matter how good your product is if you can't get it out of where you make it. He invested $7,500, bought a lot from the Moravian church right next to the tracks, and in the spring of 1875 put up what he called the Little Red Factory, a 2-story building with about 4,500 square feet. Smaller than a tennis court, with a handful of seasonal workers, he produced 150,000 pounds of chewing tobacco in his first year. Now, Winston already had 15 tobacco companies. Reynolds was just another one. So what made him different? He was willing to cheat. In the late 1880s, he revolutionized chewing tobacco by secretly adding saccharin as a sweetener. But publicly, he claimed that tobacco grown near Winston was naturally sweet. That it was the soil, the climate, something special about the place. A lie. It was chemistry. And that lie gave him a devastating competitive edge. His rivals couldn't figure out why Reynolds' tobacco tasted better. Some of his chewing brands, Annie, Lula, Lottie, were named after his girlfriends. His flagship brands were Schnapps and Brown's Mule. By the 1890s, production was already measured in millions of pounds a year. In 1888, he formed a partnership with his younger brother William Neal Reynolds, who everyone called Mr. Will, and with accountant Henry Rohn. Reynolds kept 75%. The company was formally incorporated on February 11, 1890. By 1892, his personal fortune had already reached $200,000, and then the biggest shark in the ocean showed up, James B. Duke, the man who controlled the American Tobacco Company, the third largest conglomerate in America, swallowed Reynolds in 1899. Reynolds accepted, but not because he wanted to, because he had no choice. He endured it, waited, swallowed his pride. For 12 years he worked under Duke's umbrella, learning how a national-scale empire operated. And when the Supreme Court broke up the trust in 1911, Reynolds came out like a caged animal that just had its door flung open. He was 61 years old, and he was about to change the industry forever. But this is where we need to talk about the man, not just the businessman. Because Reynolds was a walking contradiction. On one hand, he was genuinely progressive for his time. He paid higher wages than average, offered profit sharing when nobody else did, built schools and housing for workers, founded Slater Hospital, the first hospital for African Americans in the South, opened a YMCA, and even an opera house. On the other hand, his fortune was built on deception and on what historians call a near-total dependence on African American labor. He built hospitals for black people while maintaining a system of racial exploitation that would define his company for generations. And his personal life was a controlled disaster. He had at least one confirmed illegitimate son, John Neal, born in 1887, who grew up in an orphanage. Reynolds supported him financially through company accounts. The oral traditions of Winston-Salem, in both black and white families, hold that there were many more. He was the most eligible bachelor in town for years until, on February 27, 1905, at 8 in the morning on a Monday, he married Mary Catherine Smith. She was 25 years younger than him. She was the daughter of his first cousin. He'd known her since she was a child. She'd worked as a secretary in his company and won $1,000 in an internal contest. Reynolds joked that he married her to get his money back. They had 4 children, and every single one of them would carry a curse that seemed written by a drunk playwright. But before the curse, the masterstroke. When the trust was dissolved in 1911, Reynolds was finally free to attack the cigarette market. He spent months studying regional brands and created something that didn't exist yet, the American blend, a revolutionary combination of burley tobacco, robust with nutty notes, Virginia flue-cured tobacco, smooth and naturally sweet, and Turkish Oriental tobacco, with an exotic aroma that evoked bazaars and caravans. Cigarettes at the time were either straight Virginia, which scraped your throat raw, or imported Turkish, which cost a fortune. Reynolds did what product geniuses do. He took the best of both worlds and sold it cheap. He tested 4 brands in 1913, Reynolds, Osman, Red Camel, and Camel. Only one survived. Why Camel? The name evoked the Turkish component, but his daughter Nancy gave another explanation years later. A circus came to town, and a camel is the animal that can travel the farthest without water. Reynolds chose that name as a direct shot at Duke, who had tried to pressure him into diluting his shares. Reynolds refused. And he named his cigarette after the animal that doesn't need anyone to give it a drink. The image on the pack has its own story, and it's too good not to tell. The first illustration was pathetic. A scrawny dromedary with pointy ears and a drooping neck. Nobody was happy with it. Then the Barnum and Bailey Circus rolled into Winston-Salem in September 1913. On Monday the 29th, Roy Haberkern, Reynolds' young secretary, rushed to the circus with photographer Andrew Jackson Farrell. The animal handler refused to let them photograph the camels. Haberkern reminded him that Reynolds always shut down the factories when the circus came to town, a practice he could very easily stop. The handler gave in but demanded a signed document. Haberkern ran to the office building, which was locked, climbed through a window, drafted the agreement, and signed it with Reynolds' name. Back at the fairgrounds, the Bactrian camel, the two-humped one, posed without any trouble. But the dromedary, whose name was Old Joe, wouldn't hold still. The trainer smacked him on the nose. Old Joe raised his tail, pinned his ears back, and shut his eyes right as the shutter clicked. That single photograph, taken of an angry animal that had just been slapped in the face, became the most recognized dromedary image on the planet. The package design was done by Fred Otto Kleesaddle, a graphic designer from Louisville everyone called Fritz. He was Belgian, and according to legend, he hid two national symbols in the illustration: the mannequin pies, visible in the camel's front leg, and the Lion of Flanders, partially hidden in the hump. And then came the campaign that invented modern marketing. Reynolds hired N.W. Ayer & Son, with William Martin Armistead in charge, and they executed what was probably the first teaser campaign in history. Day 1, a simple ad with the word camels and Old Joe's photo, no mention of tobacco. Day 2, the camels are coming, still no explanation of what it was. Day 3, tomorrow there'll be more camels in this city than in all of Asia and Africa combined. Day 4, Camel cigarettes are here. They paraded real camels through towns while handing out free cigarettes. The pack itself said there were no coupons, no giveaways, that all the money went into better tobacco. And Reynolds was selling cheaper than the competition. Ruthless, but brilliant. The numbers that followed are hard to wrap your head around. 425 million cigarettes sold in the first full year, 1914. By 1916, 6.5 billion. By 1919, 21 billion. And by 1925, 34 billion cigarettes a year, representing more than 43% of every cigarette sold in America. Not of the leading brand. Of all cigarettes in the country, nearly half were Camels. And then came the war. World War I was the accelerant that turned success into a mass phenomenon. General Pershing sent a cable to Washington that read, "You ask me what we need to win this war, and I answer tobacco, as much as bullets." In 1918, the Army began including manufactured cigarettes in field rations, 4 a day per soldier. Before the war, Americans smoked 18 billion cigarettes a year. Afterward, the number doubled to 45 billion by 1920. Veterans came home with their addictions, and cigarettes went from being seen as a feminine affectation to a symbol of rugged masculinity. Camel, the soldier's brand. In 1952, Camel set an absolute record for a single cigarette brand, 105 billion in 1 year. And by its 65th anniversary in 1978, it had sold more than 3 trillion cigarettes. Stanford historian Robert Proctor has estimated that those cigarettes caused roughly 4 million deaths, 1 death for every million cigarettes smoked. But in the 20s, nobody was talking about death, only money. And the money flowed like a river. What Reynolds did to Winston-Salem has no equivalent in American industrial history. Before him, it was a Moravian settlement of a few hundred people. By 1920, the population had surpassed 48,000, briefly making it the largest city in North Carolina. By the 40s, 60% of all workers in the city worked for Reynolds or for the Haynes textile mills. The local saying was that nothing happened in Winston-Salem unless it was approved first on the 19th floor of the Reynolds building. The economic ecosystem was total. Wachovia National Bank became one of the largest financial institutions in the Southeast thanks to Reynolds deposits. The company's law firm, Womble, Carlyle, Sandridge and Rice, became the largest in North Carolina. Reynolds' money funded the relocation of Wake Forest University to Winston-Salem in 1956 with the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation, offering $350,000 annually in perpetuity, and the family donating 330 acres of the Reynolds estate. Reynolds was the largest taxpayer in North Carolina. He paid $4 out of every $10 in state taxes. One single company. $4 out of every $10. And here comes the fact that sounds made up but isn't. Reynolds imported such massive quantities of Turkish tobacco and French rolling paper that the federal government designated Winston-Salem as an official port of entry in 1916, more than 200 miles from the ocean. A full federal customs office operating in a city that had never seen a ship. By trade volume, Winston-Salem was the 8th largest port of entry in the United States and the biggest in the entire American South. Let that sink in. A town with no salt water, no docks, no cargo cranes, processing more international trade than coastal cities with centuries of maritime history, because one man needed that tobacco and that paper to keep feeding the beast. And the beast needed a symbol of power. In 1929, the Reynolds Building was completed. 21 stories, 314 feet tall, clad in Indiana limestone with Art Deco detailing, at a cost of $2,700,000. It was the tallest building in the United States, south of Baltimore. The architects were R. H. Shreve and William Lamb, and they won Building of the Year from the National Architecture Association. That award landed them the commission for the Empire State Building that same year. William Lamb explicitly used the Reynolds Building as a template. Both share the stepped ziggurat silhouette and the clean Art Deco lines carved into the same Indiana limestone. In 1979, the general manager of the Empire State Building sent a message. "Happy anniversary, Dad." A tobacco company's headquarters spawned the most famous skyscraper in the world. Today, the Reynolds Building houses the luxury Kimpton Cardinal Hotel, and its restaurant is called Catherine Brasserie and Bar, in honor of Catherine Smith Reynolds. And while it was raising skyscrapers, Reynolds was also building entire neighborhoods. In 1917, the company bought 84 acres and put up 180 homes sold at cost to its workers, forming the Reynoldstown neighborhood. A generous gesture, right? Except for one detail. The development was designated primarily for white employees, in a company where more than 80% of the workforce was black. You build houses for your workers, but only for the ones with the right skin color. That was Reynolds, progressive and ruthless at the same time. But we'll get to her, because her story, and the story of the entire Reynolds family, is a catalog of tragedies that seems designed to prove that money can't buy anything that matters. Richard Joshua Reynolds died on July 29, 1918, 9 days after turning 68, at Reynolds House, the mansion his wife had built. Pancreatic cancer, a disease we now know is directly linked to tobacco use. Reynolds chewed tobacco his entire life. The treatments of the era included quarantine, pulling out every one of his teeth, and major surgery in Philadelphia. Nothing worked. They brought him back to Reynolds to die. At the time of his death, his company employed 10,000 people in 121 buildings. He was the richest man in North Carolina. His annual tax bill of $66,000 was double that of the next highest taxpayer. The banks and City Hall closed for his funeral. The City Council asked every business to shut down for 3 hours. And for 41 years, no portrait of another chief executive was hung beside his in the boardroom. The king was dead, but the curse was just getting started. Catherine Smith Reynolds was what people back then called a new kind of Southern woman. Progressive, activist, she built a racially integrated YWCA in the heart of Jim Crow, convinced her husband to open cafeterias serving hot meals to both white and black employees, created a nursery for workers' children, offered nighttime literacy classes, and she built Reynolds House, a 1,000-acre estate with a 64-room mansion she modestly called the Bungalow. 2 kitchens, 3 dumbwaiters, an elevator, 14 bathrooms, a telephone in every room, an aeolian pipe organ, central vacuum, air conditioning, and stainless steel countertops. The grounds included formal gardens, a 9-hole golf course, polo fields, a man-made lake christened Lake Catherine, a swimming pool, and a complete farming village. They moved in December 1917. Reynolds died there 7 months later. After his death, Catherine married J. Edward Johnston, a 25-year-old school headmaster at Reynolds, 13 years younger than her. Her eldest son Dick was fiercely opposed. In early 1924, at 43, Catherine became pregnant against her doctor's orders. On May 21st, she gave birth. 3 days later, on the 23rd, she died from an embolism. She was 43 years old. Her 4 Reynolds children, aged 13 to 18, were orphaned, millionaires, with no guidance, with no one to protect them from themselves or from their fortune. And of all of them, the story of Zachary Smith Reynolds is the one you can't make up because no one would believe you. Born on November 5, 1911, he lost his father at 6 and his mother at 12. At Woodbury Forest Boarding School, he joined the Smokers Club, earning the nickname Camel Reynolds, and wrote at least 2 suicide notes as a teenager. One read, "My girl has turned me down, goodbye forever. Give my love to Mary, Virginia, Nancy, Dick, etc. Goodbye, cruel world." He dropped out at 15 to pursue aviation, and by 17 had become the youngest person in the country to hold a transport pilot's license. He stood to inherit roughly $20 million when he turned 28, about $460 million in today's money. His first marriage, to Ann Cannon, a textile heiress, was a shotgun wedding at 2 in the morning in York, South Carolina, after her father caught them together. It lasted 2 years and ended with $500,000 for Anne and another $500,000 for their daughter. 6 days after the divorce was finalized, on November 29, 1931, Smith married Libby Holman, a Broadway singer, famous for her smoky voice and songs like Moanin' Low and Body and Soul, which was banned from radio for obscenity. Openly bisexual, she had a well-known relationship with Louisa Carpenter, a DuPont Harris. She was about 7 years older than Smith. A friend attributed a devastating line to her. "If the Cannon girl got $1 million out of this, why shouldn't I get 5? The night of July 5th into the 6th, 1932, Smith and Libby threw a party at Reynolds House. Past midnight, Libby was drunk. She told Smith she was pregnant. There was a tense confrontation. Smith allegedly told his best friend and secretary Ab Walker, "Our round-the-world trip is off, and I'm going to end it all tonight," tossing him his wallet. Shortly after midnight, a shot rang out from a .32 caliber Mauser pistol, Smith's talisman, the one he used to fire out his bedroom window. It was a cicada emergence year in the southern Appalachians, so the bullet was only heard as a muffled pop. Libby ran to the balcony screaming, "Smith has shot himself." He died at North Carolina Baptist Hospital that morning. He was 20 years old. The coroner ruled it suicide. Sheriff Transu Scott had his doubts. Libby claimed total amnesia covering 48 hours. She allegedly told Louisa Carpenter, "I was so drunk last night I don't know if I shot him or not." At the inquest, she showed up in a white negligee that left little to the imagination. A nurse testified that she found Libby and Ab Walker on the floor wrestling in a compromising position at the hospital the morning Smith died. Libby's clothes turned up in Walker's room. On August 4, 1932, a grand jury indicted both of them for first-degree murder. The penalty, the electric chair. Libby fled with Louisa Carpenter, who posted her $25,000 bail and showed up dressed in such masculine clothing that reporters thought she was a man. The New York Daily Mirror ran a 27-part series accusing Libby of being a sexual pirate, an insatiable red, an iceberg of contempt. But the Reynolds family stepped in. They insisted Smith had killed himself. William Neal Reynolds pressured the prosecutor to drop the charges. The deciding factor: Libby was pregnant with a Reynolds heir, and the family feared the scandal of a baby born in prison more than the absence of justice. On November 15, 1932, Libby and Walker walked free. Her son, Christopher Topper Reynolds, was born on January 10, 1933. He weighed 3.5 pounds. Tragedy kept stalking Libby Holman like a shadow with teeth. Her second husband, actor Ralph Holmes, died of a barbiturate overdose at 29. Suicide. Topper died at 17, falling from the east face of Mount Whitney while climbing. Libby never saw his body. She bitterly referred to the photos of her dead husbands and son as the gallery of all my romantic homicides. Her sister killed herself. Her close friend Montgomery Clift died. Martin Luther King, whose trip to India in 1959 she had funded, was assassinated. On June 18, 1971, Libby was found dying in her Rolls-Royce from carbon monoxide poisoning at her Connecticut estate. She was 67 years old. The rest of the Reynolds clan didn't fare any better. Dick married 4 times, paid $9 million in a divorce settlement that was the largest in history, was publicly humiliated when his wife Mary Ann had an affair with playboy Porfirio Rubirosa, allegedly killed someone while driving drunk, and died of emphysema at 58, caught bribing the staff to smuggle him camels after promising his last wife he'd quit. Mary Catherine died of stomach cancer at 45. R. J. Reynolds III died of emphysema and heart failure from smoking Camels and Winstons. An entire family consumed by the product that gave them everything. But while the heirs were tearing each other apart, something far worse was happening inside the factories. Something that had nothing to do with money or family scandals, but with the thousands of people who walked through separate doors every morning to build that fortune with their bare hands. The R. J. Reynolds Company was built on African American labor. The company sent trains to South Carolina and eastern North Carolina to bring workers to the factories. At its peak, more than 80% of the workforce was black when seasonal workers were included. More than half of all employed black women in Winston-Salem worked in Reynolds tobacco factories. The alternative was domestic service in white homes. Jim Crow governed every aspect of life inside those factories. Separate entrances, separate cafeterias, separate bathrooms, separate water fountains. Robert Korstad, author of the definitive academic study on the subject, wrote that every morning a black worker walked through the colored door. Segregation became a little more eternal and inevitable. Black workers were relegated to the worst jobs. The stemming rooms, the halls where stems were torn from tobacco leaves, were staffed almost exclusively by black women. They worked in sweltering rooms, thick with tobacco dust, feeding leaves between spinning blades at dangerous speeds. The buildings had barely changed since the days of slavery. The women covered themselves with used burlap sacks to stay warm in winter. Hiring practices looked like slave auctions. The foremen would line us up against the walls and pick the strongest and sturdiest ones. Foremen were described as worse than the Gestapo. Women, black and white, endured routine, verbal, and sexual abuse. White workers got the cleaner, better-paying positions: machine operation and supervision. Black workers were automatically classified as unskilled regardless of their actual ability, and were paid significantly less, about 10 cents an hour less than white workers. Robert Chick Black, a union organizer, remembered making 10 cents an hour before unionization. Even with the Fair Labor Standards Act in place, the stemmers of Winston-Salem earned barely half of what the federal government considered a subsistence minimum. Theodosia Simpson put it this way: "I knew how they treated my people, because during the Depression, Reynolds Tobacco made $30 million in profit when people were starving to death, standing in bread lines and soup lines. On June 17, 1943, at plant number 65, a black stemmer, a widow with 5 children, was too sick to work. A foreman told her that if she couldn't keep up, there was the door. The woman began to cry. Theodosia Simpson, a young woman whose path to college had been cut short by the Depression, organized roughly 200 women to walk off the job after lunch. While they confronted the foreman, James Pickens McCardle, a 38-year-old cart pusher from the adjacent room, stood up and said, "If these women are standing up for their rights, I'm with them." Moments later, McCardle collapsed and died from a cerebral hemorrhage on the factory floor. He had repeatedly tried to get medical attention from the company nurse. He was denied. Think about that. A man dies standing up for women who were crying because a foreman told them the door was right there if they couldn't keep pace while sick. He died on the floor of a factory pulling in millions, and the nurse wouldn't see him. McCardle's death was the spark. The next day, 1,600 women in the largest stemming rooms showed up for work and refused to start. They asked for Robert Chick Black to represent them. Reynolds' management agreed, thinking Black would calm the workers down. Instead, Black sent word to colleagues across the entire plant and shut the whole factory down, all 5 floors. By the end of the week, roughly 10,000 workers had brought the biggest factory in the South to a standstill. Black pastors across the city opened their churches for union meetings. Local 22 of the FTACIO won formal recognition in December 1943 with 65% of the vote. The first contract secured higher wages, seniority rights, a grievance procedure, better restrooms, and $1,250,000 in back pay. Minimum wages went up by 50%. And out of that strike came a figure who deserves to be remembered. Miranda Smith. Born in 1915 to a sharecropping family in Dunbar, South Carolina. She arrived in Winston-Salem at 5 and became a stemmer, a slave by another name, tearing tobacco leaves from their stems with her bare hands all day long. After the 43 strike, she rose quickly through union leadership. In 1947, she was elected to the National Executive Board of the FTA, becoming the first black woman in national union leadership in the United States. She openly defied the Ku Klux Klan. She told the FTA convention, "Let's stop playing games, let's give them something to look forward to, not words but action." She served as Southern Regional Director overseeing union organizing across the Jim Crow South. White negotiators from Reynolds initially refused to speak to her. Her colleagues would instruct, "Direct your comments to Sister Smith." She died of a stroke on April 12, 1950, at 34 years old, worn down by years of relentless organizing under racism, anti-communist persecution, and sheer exhaustion. Her funeral was one of the largest in Winston-Salem history, because that's how they destroyed the Union. Not with arguments, with the Red Scare. The Winston-Salem Journal, owned by Gordon Gray, a Reynolds shareholder, ran stories connecting the Union to the Communist Party. The FBI systematically intimidated members. The House Un-American Activities Committee investigated. The CIO expelled the FTA in 1949, accusing it of communist domination. And here's what stings. In March 1950, when the government demanded a vote on whether Local 22 should continue representing the workers, even after 4 years of anti-communist harassment, a slim majority voted in favor of keeping their union. But the government counted the ballots of workers who had quit or been promoted to supervisory positions, tipping the result the other way. Velma Hopkins, a Local 22 activist, summed up what was lost. "It wasn't just wages we wanted, it was freedom." The union had registered thousands of black voters and had powered the election of Reverend Kenneth R. Williams as the first black candidate to defeat a white opponent in a southern city in the 20th century. Paul Robeson, Woody Guthrie, and Pete Seeger came to Winston-Salem to sing and stand with Local 22. After it was crushed, a decade passed before mass protest against Jim Crow revived in the city. And some of the first to join the new movement were the sons and daughters of local 22 members. The seed Reynolds tried to rip out bloomed anyway. But now the story has to turn to something even darker. Because while the workers were fighting for dignity, the company was assembling the greatest corporate deception campaign of the 20th century. And to tell it, we need to start with a slogan, a billboard in Times Square, and a doctor who was never actually a doctor. I'd walk a mile for a camel. The origin story. A painter was working on a camel billboard when a stranger walked up, asked for a cigarette, was offered a camel, and said those exact words. Adman William Armistead recognized a golden slogan when he heard one. The phrase entered the American vocabulary and was used for more than 50 years. And the ultimate symbol of its cultural power? A billboard in Times Square, 100 feet by 30, installed in 1941, with real steam puffing out of a man's mouth every few seconds. A New York City landmark for 25 years, until 1966. Millions of people walked past that cloud of artificial smoke every day without thinking about what real smoke was doing inside their lungs. Because by then, Reynolds already knew exactly what it was doing, and they were lying about it. On February 2, 1953, Claude E. Teague, a Reynolds research chemist, drafted a confidential internal document titled Survey of Cancer Research. His conclusion: clinical data studies tend to confirm the relationship between heavy, prolonged tobacco use and the incidence of lung cancer. 9 years later, in 1962, senior scientist F. Alan Rajman wrote an internal report that was even more damning. Obviously, the amount of evidence accumulated to indict cigarette smoke as a health hazard is overwhelming. The evidence challenging such an indictment is scanty. Rajman questioned the ethics of suppressing data to protect economic standing. After he retired, Reynolds' law firm paid him $600,000 over a decade for consulting services. In a sworn deposition, he reversed course. I believe there is no proof of a cause and effect relationship. $600,000 to change your mind. Ruthless, but effective. Reynolds knew as early as 1959 that cigarette smoke contained radioactive polonium-210. They conducted exhaustive research throughout the 60s, and they deliberately kept that information hidden, prohibiting any publication on radioactivity in tobacco smoke. So what did they do publicly while hiding all this? The exact opposite. On January 4, 1954, Reynolds and 13 other tobacco companies published a full-page ad in 448 newspapers, reaching 43 million Americans. It read, "We believe that the products we make are not injurious to health." Coordinated by the public relations firm Hill & Knowlton, it announced the creation of the Tobacco Industry Research Committee. Judge Gladys Kessler would describe it decades later as a brilliantly conceived and executed strategy to cast doubt on the health accusations without quite denying them. But the crown jewel of hypocrisy was the campaign everyone remembers. More doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. Launched in 1946, Reynolds claimed it was based on surveys of 113,597 physicians conducted by 3 independent organizations. The reality: employees of Reynolds' advertising agency, the William Esty Company, attended medical conventions, handed out free cartons of Camels to the doctors, and then immediately asked them what brand they smoked. The trick: many cited Camels, having received them for free 5 minutes earlier. The doctors in the ads were actors in white coats. Real physicians risked losing their licenses if they did advertising. The ads appeared in the Journal of the American Medical Association, in Life, in Time, in Good Housekeeping. Internal memos warned against implying that doctors recommended smoking, while the entire campaign existed to create exactly that impression. And here's a scene that would play like dark comedy if it weren't real. The Camel News Caravan, one of the first television news programs in America, broadcast on NBC, with anchor John Cameron Swayze. Reynolds' sponsorship came with total editorial control. Swayze was required to have a lit Camel cigarette in an ashtray on his desk at all times, with the smoke visibly rising on camera. The irony: Swayze didn't smoke. His doctors had told him it was bad for his health. The free cartons delivered to him every week piled up at his house. No cigars could be shown on screen. Cancer-related news was reportedly censored. The show opened with, "Sit back, light up a Camel, and be an eyewitness to the happenings that made history in the last 24 hours. A newsman who didn't smoke, forced to keep a lit cigarette on camera, delivering news censored by the company that signed his checks. Put that in a movie, and nobody buys it." But nothing compares to Joe Camel. The character was originally created in 1974 by British artist Nicholas Price for a French camel campaign. In 1988, redesigned by art director Mike Salisbury for the McCann Erickson Agency, he was introduced to the American market for Camel's 75th anniversary. Joe was a smooth, muscular character with a human body and a camel's head, sunglasses, leather jackets, tuxedos. He played pool, rode motorcycles, drove convertibles. The Camel Cash program offered merchandise: t-shirts, hats, watches, boxers. Customers collected bills from the packs. And then the bomb dropped. On December 11, 1991, the Journal of the American Medical Association published 3 studies that changed everything. 91.3% of 6-year-olds correctly identified Joe Camel with cigarettes, nearly the same percentage that associated the Disney logo with Mickey Mouse. Even 30% of 3-year-olds could make the connection. High schoolers recognized Joe Camel at a rate of 97.7% versus 72.2% for adults. Camel's market share among smokers under 18 skyrocketed from 0.5% to 32.8% in 3 years. Estimated annual sales to minors: $476 million. And Reynolds' internal documents proved the strategy was deliberate. A 1973 memo from chemist Claude Teague said, word for word, "Realistically, if our company is to survive and prosper over the long term, we must get our share of the youth market." A 1998 document was even more blunt. Young adults are the only source of replacement smokers. Fewer than 1/3 of smokers begin after 18. The company invented the euphemism "FUBS first usual brand younger adult smokers" as code for teenagers choosing their first regular cigarette brand. President Clinton said it plainly. Let's stop pretending that a cartoon camel in a funny costume is trying to sell to adults and not children. Surgeon General Antonia Novello called for an end to the campaign. The Federal Trade Commission filed a formal complaint, the first ever against a cigarette company, for unfair practices. On July 10, 1997, Reynolds officially killed Joe Camel. Adbusters magazine published Joe Chemo, a dying Joe Camel in a hospital bed hooked up to an IV drip. And then came the moment of truth. On April 14, 1994, 7 executives from the major tobacco companies testified under oath before Congress. James W. Johnston, president of Reynolds, declared, "Cigarettes and nicotine clearly do not meet the classic definition of addiction. There is no intoxication." He also stated, "We do not market to children and will not." Internal documents showed that Reynolds had surveyed 11,000 teenagers aged 14 to 17 and explicitly identified the 14 to 18 group as a critical market. The Department of Justice investigated for perjury, but never brought charges. The executives had used the word believe, making it impossible to prove they lied about subjective beliefs. 7 men in suits, right hands raised, swearing that what they sold didn't kill or hook people. while their own labs had been saying exactly the opposite for decades. On August 17, 2006, Judge Gladys Kessler issued a 1,683-page opinion declaring Reynolds and other tobacco companies guilty under the RICO Act, the same law used against organized crime. The exact words: "The defendants have engaged in and executed, and continue to engage in and execute, a massive 50-year scheme to defraud the public. They marketed and sold their lethal product with zeal, with deception, with a single-minded focus on their financial success, and without regard for the human tragedy or social costs. Organized crime, that's what they were. Not street-level dealers. Executives in silk ties who bought art, funded universities, and bankrolled political campaigns. The Master Settlement Agreement of 1998 forced the four largest tobacco companies, Reynolds included, to pay a minimum of $206 billion over 25 years to 46 states. It permanently dissolved the Tobacco Institute and the Council for Tobacco Research. It banned cartoon characters and outdoor advertising. It required the release of 13 million pages of internal documents. And how much of that money did the states dedicate to prevention programs? Less than 3 cents of every dollar. Let that sink in. $206 billion in compensation, and less than 3% went toward keeping others from falling into the same trap. And this is where Patrick Reynolds enters the picture, the founder's grandson, the man who carried the full weight of this tragedy in his own flesh. He watched his father Dick die of emphysema at 58, caught bribing the staff to sneak him Camels. He watched his half-brother die of emphysema and heart failure. He sold his tobacco stock in 1979. He quit smoking in 1985 after 17 years and 11 failed attempts. And in June 1986, he testified before Congress calling for a ban on all tobacco advertising. To the horror of his family, he wrote, "My only memories of my father are of a man lying down, gasping for air, counting the time he had left to live. The great-grandson of the man who built the Camel Empire dedicated his life to tearing it down." He founded the Foundation for a Smoke-Free America, and in 2015 received President Obama's Lifetime Achievement Award. But while Patrick was fighting the family legacy, another man was about to blow the company apart from the inside. And this one didn't need moral reasons. He just needed money. F. Ross Johnson, a Canadian from Winnipeg born in 1931, clawed his way up from Standard Brands to Nabisco, to the CEO chair at RJR Nabisco, which at the time was the largest consumer products company in the world. His philosophy: anything that doesn't change rots. And money is meant to be spent generously. How generously? The RJR Air Force consisted of 10 private planes operated by 36 corporate pilots. Johnson ordered 2 Gulfstream jets at $21 million each, and built a $12 million hangar nicknamed the Taj Mahal. His dog Rocco, a German shepherd who bit a security guard at a golf tournament, was put on a company plane listed as passenger G. Shepherd, and flown 3,000 kilometers with an executive escort. Celebrity athletes were on retainer. Jack Nicklaus at $1 million a year, O.J. Simpson at $250,000. Board members earned $50,000 with unlimited access to the corporate jets. And then there was the cigarette that tasted like burnt Brussels sprouts. Project Premier, a smokeless cigarette with the code name Project S, PA, top secret, had been hidden from the board for 5 years by the previous CEO, at a cost of $68 million in unauthorized spending. The product was a contraption with a carbon tip that heated tobacco and flavor pellets, 0 tar, and 97% less nicotine. But consumers described the taste as burnt Brussels sprouts, burning plastic, old tennis shoe, and barn waste. Total losses reached somewhere between $800 million and $1 billion. Premier launched in October 1988, and was pulled in February 1989. 4 months. $1 billion. With Premier dead and the stock stuck in the low 40s despite 25% profit increases, Johnson proposed a management-led leveraged buyout on October 19, 1988, $75 a share, $17.6 billion. His goal, in his own words, "We're not talking about money to send someone to hell, we're talking about money to send everybody to hell." The board declared the company in play. Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, led by Henry Kravis and George Roberts, countered at 90 a share. First, Boston launched a pirate bid allegedly going as high as 118. Ted Forstmann called Kravis's financing phony junk bond money and demanded, "We need to push the barbarians back from the city gates." On the dramatic night of November 30, 1988, the sealed bids were opened. Johnson's group offered 112 per share. KKR offered 109. The board chose KKR's lower bid because Johnson's lacked a guaranteed reset clause, and the board was disgusted by his personal golden parachute of $100 million. The cover of Time magazine read, "A Game of Greed." KKR's $25 billion buyout was the largest in history. Johnson walked away with $53 million in severance and never ran a major company again. The devastation was surgical. The deal was financed with 87% debt, roughly $29 billion in total obligations. Interest payments exploded from $549 million to $3,380 million in a single year. To service the debt, KKR dismantled the empire piece by piece. Del Monte for $1.47 billion. The European food businesses for $2.5 billion. Chun King, the 20% stake in ESPN. International tobacco operations were sold to Japan Tobacco for $8 billion in 1999. Nabisco was sold to Philip Morris in 2000. 1,640 employees were laid off in August 1989 alone. 12% of the workforce, gone in one stroke. Reynolds' labor force in Winston-Salem fell from around 16,000 to roughly 4,000 over time. According to the Department of Labor, 72% of displaced workers found new jobs, but they earned less than half their previous salary. Brian Burrow and John Helyar told the story in Barbarians at the Gate, which became a massive bestseller and an HBO movie starring James Garner and Jonathan Pryce that won the Emmy for Best Television Movie. But for Winston-Salem, it wasn't entertainment. It was their lives. In January 1987, before the LBO even happened, Johnson had already moved RJR Nabisco's headquarters from Winston-Salem to Cobb County, Georgia, claiming the city didn't have the right image for a top-tier company. After the LBO, headquarters moved to Manhattan. A former mayor said Winston-Salem had been like a baby in the womb of R.J. Reynolds. Both relocations were experienced as devastating betrayals. The 80s brought what the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond called a cascade of losses. In 1980, the city's population declined for the first time in history. McLean Trucking, the fifth largest in the country with roughly 10,000 local employees, went bankrupt in 1986. Piedmont Airlines was absorbed by U.S. Air in 1988, taking more than 5,000 jobs with it. AT&T closed offices that at their peak had employed 13,000 people. All of this in a city of 162,000 residents. And then, Whitaker Park, the largest cigarette factory in the world, went dark. 790,000 square feet of machinery that for half a century had spit out millions of Camels a day fell silent. In May 2010, Reynolds announced the closure. By mid-2011, production had completely ceased, consolidated at the Tobaccoville plant north of the city. There was no ceremony. There was no farewell speech. 14 acres of industrial floor, more than 2,000 workers at its peak, closed the way things close in America, with a press release and a cardboard box to pack up your stuff. Meanwhile, the cigarette that had once dominated America was dying. Philip Morris had pulled off one of the greatest marketing coups in business history, repositioning Marlboro from a feminine luxury cigarette to the Marlboro Man in 1954. Camel's trajectory tells the story. More than 43% in 1925, still number one at 22% in 1954. Out of the top 5, by 1970, down to 4.4% in 1988, when they launched Joe Camel, and roughly 7.9% today, third brand behind Marlboro and Newport. In 2012, Camel was overtaken by Pall Mall as Reynolds' own best-selling brand. How do you even process that? Your own budget brand passing you on the right. Reynolds lost its position as the nation's largest cigarette manufacturer to Philip Morris in 1983. It never got it back. In July 2004, the British-American tobacco subsidiary Brown & Williamson merged with Reynolds to form Reynolds American, with BAT controlling 42%. In 2014, Reynolds acquired Lorillard for $27.4 billion, gaining the Newport brand. And on July 25, 2017, BAT completed the acquisition of the remaining 57.8% of Reynolds American for $49.4 billion. The most American cigarette brand ever made, born in a little red factory beside the railroad tracks in 1875, became the full property of a British corporation. In December 2023, BAT announced a write-down of $31.5 billion on the Reynolds American brands. Their market capitalization had fallen below what they had paid for the stake alone. They bought an empire and watched it shrink in their hands. But here's the final twist. The old Reynolds factory complex, 145 acres in downtown Winston-Salem where billions of camels were rolled, has been reborn as the Innovation Quarter. More than $700 million in investment. The Wake Forest School of Medicine was the first academic tenant in 1993, moving into a former Reynolds warehouse. The district now houses more than 170 companies, 5 academic institutions, over 3,700 workers, and 1,800 students across 1.9 million square feet. The Wake Forest Institute for Regenerative Medicine was the first to grow and implant lab-created organs in human patients. Biotech Place, a $100 million renovation of 2 former Reynolds warehouses, houses biotechnology research. The Bailey Power Plant, which once fueled the cigarette machines, now houses restaurants and breweries, its iconic smokestacks preserved as monuments. And the most exquisite irony of all, the very first company in the research park, Targacept Incorporated, was a pharmaceutical company literally born out of R.J. Reynolds tobacco itself. And at Whitaker Park, where the camels were made, a company called Nature's Value now produces vitamins and nutritional supplements. Where trillions of cigarettes that caused millions of deaths were once manufactured, today scientists grow human organs, develop cancer treatments, and conduct regenerative medicine research. Reynolda House, where Smith Reynolds was shot and R.J. Reynolds died of cancer, is now a museum of American art. The factories are laboratories. The power plant is a brewery. The smokestacks that once belched black smoke are decorative monuments. And the question that hangs over the repurposed ruins of Camel City, over the clean bones of what was once the largest tobacco empire in America, is the same one faced by every city that one day discovers the company that gave it everything can also take it all away. What are you when the monster that made you dies? Winston-Salem found an answer. It turned the monster's guts into a place that heals what the monster caused. It's a partial redemption, incomplete, imperfect, but it's more than most factory towns ever get. because most of them are just left with the ruins.